Chapters 16 and 17 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This recording is in the public domain. Chapters 16 and 17 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This recording is in the public domain. She had had no hidden motive in wishing him not to take her home. It simply struck her that for some days past she had consumed an inordinate quantity of his time, and the independent spirit of the American girl, whom extravagance of aid places in an attitude that she ends by finding affected, had made her decide that for these few hours she must suffice to herself. She had moreover a great fondness for intervals of solitude, which since her arrival in England had been but meagrely met. It was a luxury she could always command at home, and she had wittingly missed it. That evening, however, an incident occurred which, had there been a critic to note it, would have taken all colour from the theory that the wish to be quite by herself had caused her to dispense with her cousin's attendance. Seated toward 9 o'clock in the dim illumination of Pratt's Hotel, and trying with the aid of 2 tall candles to lose herself in a volume she had brought from Gardencourt, she succeeded only to the extent of reading other words than those printed on the page, words that Ralph had spoken to her that afternoon. Suddenly the well-muffled knuckle of the waiter was applied to the door, which presently gave way to his exhibition even as a glorious trophy of the card of a visitor. When this memento had offered to her fixed sight the name of Mr. Caspar Goodwood, she let the man stand before her without signifying her wishes. "Shall I show the gentleman up, ma'am?" he asked with a slightly encouraging inflection. Isabel hesitated still, and while she hesitated glanced at the mirror. "He may come in," she said at last, and waited for him, not so much smoothing her hair as girding her spirit. Caspar Goodwood was accordingly the next moment shaking hands with her, but saying nothing till the servant had left the room. "Why didn't you answer my letter?" he then asked in a quick, full, slightly peremptory tone, the tone of a man whose questions were habitually pointed and who was capable of much insistence. She answered by a ready question. "How did you know I was here?" "Miss Stackpole let me know," said Caspar Goodwood. "She told me you would probably be at home alone this evening and would be willing to see me." "Where did she see you to tell you that?" "She didn't see me. She wrote to me." Isabel was silent. Neither had sat down. They stood there with an air of defiance, or at least of contention. "Henrietta never told me she was writing to you," she said at last. "This is not kind of her." "Is it so disagreeable to you to see me?" asked the young man. "I didn't expect it. I don't like surprises." "But you knew I was in town. It was natural we should meet." "Do you call this meeting? I hoped I shouldn't see you. In so big a place as London it seemed very possible." "It was apparently repugnant to you even to write to me," her visitor went on. Isabel made no reply. The sense of Henrietta Stackpole's treachery, as she momentarily qualified it, was strong within her. "Henrietta's certainly not a model of all the delicacies," she exclaimed with bitterness. "It was a great liberty to take." "I suppose I'm not a model either, of those virtues or of any others. The fault's mine as much as hers." As Isabel looked at him, it seemed to her that his jaw had never been more square. This might have displeased her, but she took a different turn. "No, it's not your fault so much as hers. What you've done was inevitable, I suppose, for you." "It was indeed!" cried Caspar Goodwood with a voluntary laugh. "And now that I have come, at any rate mayn't I stay?" "You may sit down, certainly." She went back to her chair again, while her visitor took the first place that offered, in the manner of a man accustomed to pay little thought to that sort of furtherance. "I've been hoping every day for an answer to my letter. You might have written me a few lines." "It wasn't the trouble of writing that prevented me. I could as easily have written you 4 pages as 1. But my silence was an intention," Isabel said. "I thought it the best thing." He sat with his eyes fixed on hers while she spoke, Then he lowered them and attached them to a spot in the carpet, as if he were making a strong effort to say nothing but what he ought. He was a strong man in the wrong, and he was acute enough to see that an uncompromising exhibition of his strength would only throw the falsity of his position into relief. Isabel was not incapable of tasting any advantage of position over a person of this quality, and though little desirous to flaunt it in his face, she could enjoy being able to say, "You know you oughtn't to have written to me yourself," and to say it with an air of triumph. Caspar Goodwood raised his eyes to her own again. They seemed to shine through the vizard of a helmet. He had a strong sense of justice, and was ready any day in the year, over and above this, to argue the question of his rights. "You said you hoped never to hear from me again. I know that. But I never accepted any such rule as my own. I warned you that you should hear very soon." "I didn't say I hoped never to hear from you," said Isabel. "Not for 5 years, then. For 10 years, 20 years. It's the same thing." "Do you find it so? It seems to me there's a great difference. I can imagine that at the end of 10 years we might have a very pleasant correspondence. I shall have matured my epistolary style." She looked away while she spoke these words, knowing them of so much less earnest a cast than the countenance of her listener. Her eyes, however, at last came back to him, just as he said very irrelevantly, "Are you enjoying your visit with your uncle?" "Very much indeed." She dropped, but then she broke out, "What good do you expect to get by insisting?" "The good of not losing you." "You've no right to talk of losing what's not yours. And even from your own point of view," Isabel added, "you ought to know when to let one alone." "I disgust you very much," said Caspar Goodwood gloomily, not as if to provoke her to compassion for a man conscious of this blighting fact, but as if to set it well before himself, so that he might endeavour to act with his eyes on it. "Yes, you don't at all delight me. You don't fit in, not in any way, just now. And the worst is that your putting it to the proof in this manner is quite unnecessary." It wasn't, certainly, as if his nature had been soft, so that pin-pricks would draw blood from it, and from the first of her acquaintance with him, and of her having to defend herself against a certain air that he had of knowing better what was good for her than she knew herself, she had recognised the fact that perfect frankness was her best weapon. To attempt to spare his sensibility, or to escape from him edgewise, as one might do from a man who had barred the way less sturdily, this, in dealing with Caspar Goodwood, who would grasp at everything of every sort that one might give him, was wasted agility. It was not that he had not susceptibilities, but his passive surface, as well as his active, was large and hard, and he might always be trusted to dress his wounds so far as they required it himself. She came back, even for her measure of possible pangs and aches in him, to her old sense that he was naturally plated and steeled, armed essentially for aggression. "I can't reconcile myself to that," he simply said. There was a dangerous liberality about it, for she felt how open it was to him to make the point that he had not always disgusted her. "I can't reconcile myself to it either, and it's not the state of things that ought to exist between us. If you'd only try to banish me from your mind for a few months, we should be on good terms again." "I see. If I should cease to think of you at all for a prescribed time, I should find I could keep it up indefinitely." "Indefinitely is more than I ask. It's more even than I should like." "You know that what you ask is impossible," said the young man, taking his adjective for granted in a manner she found irritating. "Aren't you capable of making a calculated effort?" she demanded. "You're strong for everything else. Why shouldn't you be strong for that?" "An effort calculated for what?" And then, as she hung fire, "I'm capable of nothing with regard to you," he went on, "but just of being infernally in love with you. If one's strong one loves only the more strongly." There's a good deal in that, and indeed our young lady felt the force of it, felt it thrown off into the vast of truth and poetry as practically a bait to her imagination. But she promptly came round. Think of me or not, as you find most possible, only leave me alone." "Until when?" "Well, for a year or two." "Which do you mean? Between 1 year and 2 there's all the difference in the world." "Call it 2 then," said Isabel, with a studied effect of eagerness. "And what shall I gain by that?" her friend asked, with no sign of wincing. "You'll have obliged me greatly." "And what will be my reward?" "Do you need a reward for an act of generosity?" "Yes, when it involves a great sacrifice." "There's no generosity without some sacrifice. Men don't understand such things. If you make the sacrifice you'll have all my admiration." "I don't care a cent for your admiration, not one straw, with nothing to show for it. When will you marry me? That's the only question." "Never, if you go on making me feel only as I feel at present." "What do I gain then by not trying to make you feel otherwise?" "You'll gain quite as much as by worrying me to death." Caspar Goodwood bent his eyes again and gazed a while into the crown of his hat. A deep flush overspread his face. She could see her sharpness had at last penetrated. This immediately had a value, classic, romantic, redeeming, what did she know, for her? The strong man in pain was one of the categories of the human appeal, little charm as he might exert in the given case. "Why do you make me say such things to you?" she cried in a trembling voice. "I only want to be gentle, to be thoroughly kind. It's not delightful to me to feel people care for me, and yet to have to try and reason them out of it. I think others also ought to be considerate. We have each to judge for ourselves. I know you're considerate, as much as you can be. You've good reasons for what you do. But I really don't want to marry, or to talk about it at all now. I shall probably never do it. No, never. I've a perfect right to feel that way, and it's no kindness to a woman to press her so hard, to urge her against her will. If I give you pain, I can only say I'm very sorry. It's not my fault. I can't marry you simply to please you. I won't say that I shall always remain your friend, because when women say that, in these situations, it passes, I believe, for a sort of mockery. But try me some day." Caspar Goodwood, during this speech, had kept his eyes fixed upon the name of his hatter, and it was not until some time after she had ceased speaking that he raised them. When he did so, the sight of a rosy, lovely eagerness in Isabel's face threw some confusion into his attempt to analyse her words. "I'll go home. I'll go to-morrow. I'll leave you alone," he brought out at last. "Only," he heavily said, "I hate to lose sight of you." "Never fear. I shall do no harm." "You'll marry some one else, as sure as I sit here," Caspar Goodwood declared. "Do you think that a generous charge?" "Why not? Plenty of men will try to make you." "I told you just now that I don't wish to marry, and that I almost certainly never shall." "I know you did, and I like your almost certainly. I put no faith in what you say." "Thank you very much. Do you accuse me of lying to shake you off? You say very delicate things." "Why should I not say that? You have given me no pledge of anything at all." "No, that's all that would be wanting." "You may perhaps even believe you're safe, from wishing to be. But you're not," the young man went on, as if preparing himself for the worst. "Very well, then, we'll put it that I'm not safe. Have it as you please." "I don't know, however," said Caspar Goodwood, "that my keeping you in sight would prevent it." "Don't you, indeed? I'm after all very much afraid of you. Do you think I'm so very easily pleased?" she asked, suddenly changing her tone. "No, I don't. I shall try to console myself with that. But there are a certain number of very dazzling men in the world, no doubt, and if there were only one it would be enough. The most dazzling of all will make straight for you. You'll be sure to take no one who isn't dazzling." "If you mean by dazzling brilliantly clever," Isabel said, "and I can't imagine what else you mean. I don't need the aid of a clever man to teach me how to live. I can find out for myself." "Find out how to live alone? I wish that when you have you'd teach me." She looked at him a moment. Then with a quick smile, "Oh, you ought to marry," she said. He might be pardoned if for an instant this exclamation seemed to him to sound the infernal note, and it is not on record that her motive for discharging such a shaft had been of the clearest. He oughtn't to stride about lean and hungry, however. She certainly felt that for him. "God forgive you," he murmured between his teeth as he turned away. Her accent had put her slightly in the wrong, and after a moment she felt the need to right herself. The easiest way to do it was to place him where she had been. "You do me great injustice. You say what you don't know," she broke out. "I shouldn't be an easy victim. I've proved it." "Oh, to me, certainly." "I've proved it to others as well." And she paused a moment. "I refused a proposal of marriage last week. What they call, no doubt, a dazzling one." "I'm very glad to hear it," said the young man gravely. "It was a proposal many girls would have accepted. It had everything to recommend it." Isabel had not proposed to herself to tell this story, but now she had begun, the satisfaction of speaking it out and doing herself justice took possession of her. "I was offered a great position and a great fortune by a person whom I like extremely." Casper watched her with intense interest. "Is he an Englishman?" "He's an English nobleman," said Isabel. Her visitor received this announcement at first in silence, but at last said, "I'm glad he's disappointed." "Well then, as you have companions in misfortune, make the best of it." "I don't call him a companion," said Casper grimly. "Why not, since I declined his offer absolutely?" "That doesn't make him my companion. Besides, he's an Englishman." "And pray, isn't an Englishman a human being?" Isabel asked. "Oh, those people? They're not of my humanity, and I don't care what becomes of them." "You're very angry," said the girl. "We've discussed this matter quite enough." "Oh yes, I'm very angry. I plead guilty to that." She turned away from him, walked to the open window and stood a moment looking into the dusky void of the street, where a turbid gaslight alone represented social animation. For some time neither of these young persons spoke. Casper lingered near the chimney piece with eyes gloomily attached. She had virtually requested him to go. He knew that. But at the risk of making himself odious he kept his ground. She was too nursed a need to be easily renounced, and he had crossed the sea all to wring from her some scrap of a vow. Presently she left the window and stood again before him. "You do me very little justice, after my telling you what I have told you just now. I'm sorry I told you, since it matters so little to you." "Ah!" cried the young man, "if you were thinking of me when you did it!" And then he paused, with the fear that she might contradict so happy a thought. "I was thinking of you a little," said Isabel. "A little? I don't understand. If the knowledge of what I feel for you had any weight with you at all, calling it a little is a poor account of it." Isabel shook her head as if to carry off a blunder. "I refused a most kind, noble gentleman. Make the most of that." "I thank you then," said Casper Goodwood gravely. "I thank you immensely." "And now you had better go home." "May I not see you again?" he asked. "I think it's better not. You'll be sure to talk of this, and you see it leads to nothing." "I promise you not to say a word that will annoy you." Isabel reflected and then answered. "I return in a day or two to my uncle's, and I can't propose to you to come there. It would be too inconsistent." Casper Goodwood on his side considered. "You must do me justice too. I received an invitation to your uncle's more than a week ago, and I declined it." She betrayed surprise. "From whom was your invitation?" "From Mr. Ralph Tutchett, whom I supposed to be your cousin. I declined it because I had not your authorization to accept it. The suggestion that Mr. Tutchett should invite me appeared to have come from Miss Stackpole." "It certainly never did from me." Henrietta really goes very far," Isabel added. "Don't be too hard on her. That touches me." "No, if you declined you did quite right, and I thank you for it." And she gave a little shudder of dismay at the thought that Lord Warburton and Mr. Goodwood might have met at Gardencourt. It would have been so awkward for Lord Warburton. "When you leave your uncle, where do you go?" her companion asked. "I go abroad with my aunt, to Florence and other places." The serenity of this announcement struck a chill to the young man's heart. He seemed to see her whirled away into circles from which he was inexorably excluded. Nevertheless he went on quickly with his questions. "And when shall you come back to America?" "Perhaps not for a long time. I'm very happy here." "Do you mean to give up your country?" "Don't be an infant." "Well, you'll be out of my sight indeed," said Caspar Goodwood. "I don't know," she answered rather grandly. "The world, with all these places so arranged and so touching each other, comes to strike one as rather small." "It's a sight too big for me," Caspar exclaimed, with a simplicity our young lady might have found touching if her face had not been set against concessions. This attitude was part of a system, a theory, that she had lately embraced, and to be thorough she said after a moment, "Don't think me unkind if I say it's just that, being out of your sight, that I like. If you were in the same place I should feel you were watching me, and I don't like that. I like my liberty too much. If there's a thing in the world I'm fond of," she went on with a slight recurrence of grandeur, "it's my personal independence." But whatever there might be of the too superior in this speech moved Caspar Goodwood's admiration. There was nothing he winced at in the large air of it. He had never supposed she hadn't wings and the need of beautiful free movements. He wasn't, with his own long arms and strides, afraid of any force in her. Isabel's words, if they had meant to shock him, failed of the mark and only made him smile with a sense that here was common ground. "Who would wish less to curtail your liberty than I? What can give me greater pleasure than to see you perfectly independent, doing whatever you like? It's to make you independent that I want to marry you." "That's a beautiful sophism," said the girl, with a smile more beautiful still. "An unmarried woman, a girl of your age, isn't independent. There are all sorts of things she can't do. She's hampered at every step." "That's as she looks at the question," Isabel answered with much spirit. "I'm not in my first youth. I can do what I choose. I belong quite to the independent class. I've neither father nor mother. I'm poor and of a serious disposition. I'm not pretty. I therefore am not bound to be timid and conventional. Indeed, I can't afford such luxuries. Besides, I try to judge things for myself. To judge wrong, I think, is more honourable than not to judge at all. I don't wish to be a mere sheep in the flock. I wish to choose my fate and know something of human affairs beyond what other people think it compatible with propriety to tell me." She paused a moment, but not long enough for her companion to reply. He was apparently on the point of doing so, when she went on. "Let me say this to you, Mr. Goodwood. You're so kind as to speak of being afraid of my marrying. If you should hear a rumour that I'm on the point of doing so, girls are liable to have such things said about them, remember what I have told you about my love of liberty, and venture to doubt it." There was something passionately positive in the tone in which she gave him this advice, and he saw a shining candour in her eyes that helped him to believe her. On the whole he felt reassured, and you might have perceived it by the manner in which he said, quite eagerly, "You want simply to travel for 2 years? I'm quite willing to wait 2 years, and you may do what you like in the interval. If that's all you want, pray say so. I don't want you to be conventional. Do I strike you as conventional myself? Do you want to improve your mind? Your mind's quite good enough for me, but if it interests you to wander about a while and see different countries, I shall be delighted to help you in any way in my power." "You're very generous. That's nothing new to me. The best way to help me will be to put as many 100 miles of sea between us as possible." "One would think you were going to commit some atrocity," said Caspar Goodwood. "Perhaps I am. I wish to be free even to do that if the fancy takes me." "Well, then," he said slowly, "I'll go home." And he put out his hand, trying to look contented and confident. Isabel's confidence in him, however, was greater than any he could feel in her. Not that he thought her capable of committing an atrocity, but, turn it over as he would, there was something ominous in the way she reserved her option. As she took his hand she felt a great respect for him. She knew how much he cared for her, and she thought him magnanimous. They stood so for a moment, looking at each other, united by a hand clasp which was not merely passive on her side. "That's right," she said, very kindly, almost tenderly. "You'll lose nothing by being a reasonable man." "But I'll come back wherever you are 2 years hence," he returned with characteristic grimness. We have seen that our young lady was inconsequent, and at this she suddenly changed her note. "Ah, remember, I promise nothing, absolutely nothing." Then, more softly, as if to help him to leave her, "And remember, too, that I shall not be an easy victim." "You'll get very sick of your independence." "Perhaps I shall. It's even very probable. When that day comes I shall be very glad to see you." She had laid her hand on the knob of the door that led into her room, and she waited a moment to see whether her visitor would not take his departure. But he appeared unable to move. There was still an immense unwillingness in his attitude and a sore remonstrance in his eyes. "I must leave you now," said Isabel, and she opened the door and passed into the other room. This apartment was dark, but the darkness was tempered by a vague radiance set up through the windows from the court of the hotel, and Isabel could make out the masses of the furniture, the dim shining of the mirror, and the looming of the big four-posted bed. She stood still a moment listening, and at last she heard Caspar Goodwood walk out of the sitting-room and close the door behind him. She stood still a little longer, and then, by an irresistible impulse, dropped on her knees before her bed and hid her face in her arms. Chapter 17. She was not praying, she was trembling, trembling all over. Vibration was easy to her, was in fact too constant with her, and she found herself now humming like a smitten harp. She only asked, however, to put on the cover, to case herself again in brown holland, but she wished to resist her excitement, and the attitude of devotion, which she kept for some time, seemed to help her to be still. She intensely rejoiced that Caspar Goodwood was gone. There was something in having thus got rid of him that was like the payment, for a stamped receipt, of some debt too long on her mind. As she felt the glad relief she bowed her head a little lower. The sense was there, throbbing in her heart. It was part of her emotion, but it was a thing to be ashamed of. It was profane and out of place. It was not for some 10 minutes that she rose from her knees, and even when she came back to the sitting-room her tremor had not quite subsided. It had had, verily, 2 causes. Part of it was to be accounted for by her long discussion with Mr. Goodwood, but it might be feared that the rest was simply the enjoyment she found in the exercise of her power. She sat down in the same chair again and took up her book, but without going through the form of opening the volume. She leaned back with that low, soft, aspiring murmur with which she often uttered her response to accidents of which the brighter side was not superficially obvious, and yielded to the satisfaction of having refused 2 ardent suitors in a fortnight. That love of liberty of which she had given Caspar Goodwood so bold a sketch was as yet almost exclusively theoretic. She had not been able to indulge it on a large scale. But it appeared to her she had done something. She had tasted of the delight, if not of battle, at least of victory. She had done what was truest to her plan. In the glow of this consciousness the image of Mr. Goodwood taking his sad walk homeward through the dingy town presented itself with a certain reproachful force, so that, as at the same moment the door of the room was opened, she rose with an apprehension that he had come back. But it was only Henrietta Stackpole returning from her dinner. Miss Stackpole immediately saw that our young lady had been through something, and indeed the discovery demanded no great penetration. She went straight up to her friend, who received her without a greeting. Isabel's elation in having sent Caspar Goodwood back to America presupposed her being in a manner glad he had come to see her; but at the same time she perfectly remembered Henrietta had had no right to set a trap for her. "Has he been here, dear?" the latter yearningly asked. Isabel turned away and for some moments answered nothing. "You acted very wrongly," she declared at last. "I acted for the best. I only hope you acted as well." "You're not the judge. I can't trust you," said Isabel. This declaration was unflattering, but Henrietta was much too unselfish to heed the charge it conveyed. She cared only for what it intimated with regard to her friend. "Isabel Archer," she observed with equal abruptness and solemnity, "if you marry one of these people I'll never speak to you again." "Before making so terrible a threat you had better wait till I'm asked," Isabel replied. Never having said a word to Miss Stackpole about Lord Warburton's overtures, she now had no impulse whatever to justify herself to Henrietta by telling her that she had refused that nobleman. "Oh, you'll be asked quick enough, once you get off on the Continent. Annie Clymer was asked 3 times in Italy. Poor plain little Annie!" "Well, if Annie Clymer wasn't captured, why should I be?" "I don't believe Annie was pressed. But you'll be." "That's a flattering conviction," said Isabel without alarm. "I don't flatter you, Isabel. I tell you the truth," cried her friend. "I hope you don't mean to tell me that you didn't give Mr. Goodwood some hope." "I don't see why I should tell you anything. As I said to you just now, I can't trust you. But since you're so much interested in Mr. Goodwood, I won't conceal from you that he returns immediately to America." "You don't mean to say you've sent him off?" Henrietta almost shrieked. "I asked him to leave me alone, and I ask you the same, Henrietta." Miss Stackpole glittered for an instant with dismay, and then passed her the mirror over the chimney piece and took off her bonnet. "I hope you've enjoyed your dinner," Isabel went on. But her companion was not to be diverted by frivolous propositions. "Do you know where you're going, Isabel Archer?" "Just now I'm going to bed," said Isabel with persistent frivolity. "Do you know where you're drifting?" Henrietta pursued, holding out her bonnet delicately. "No, I haven't the least idea, and I find it very pleasant not to know. A swift carriage of a dark night rattling with 4 horses over roads that one can't see, that's my idea of happiness." "Mr. Goodwood certainly didn't teach you to say such things as that, like the heroine of an immoral novel," said Miss Stackpole. "You're drifting to some great mistake." Isabel was irritated by her friend's interference, yet she still tried to think what truth this declaration could represent. She could think of nothing that diverted her from saying, "You must be very fond of me, Henrietta, to be willing to be so aggressive." "I love you intensely, Isabel," said Miss Stackpole with feeling. "Well, if you love me intensely, let me as intensely alone. I asked that of Mr. Goodwood, and I must also ask it of you." "Take care you're not let alone too much." "That's what Mr. Goodwood said to me. I told him I must take the risks." "You're a creature of risks. You make me shudder," cried Henrietta. "When does Mr. Goodwood return to America?" "I don't know. He didn't tell me." "Perhaps you didn't inquire," said Henrietta with a note of righteous irony. "I gave him too little satisfaction to have the right to ask questions of him." This assertion seemed to Miss Stackpole for a moment to bid defiance to comment, but at last she exclaimed, "Well, Isabel, if I didn't know you, I might think you were heartless." "Take care," said Isabel. "You're spoiling me." "I'm afraid I've done that already. I hope at least," Miss Stackpole added, "that he may cross with Annie Climber." Isabel learned from her the next morning that she had determined not to return to Gardencourt, where old Mr. Touchett had promised her a renewed welcome, but to await in London the arrival of invitation that Mr. Bantling had promised her from his sister, Lady Pensel. Miss Stackpole related very freely her conversation with Ralph Touchett's sociable friend, and declared to Isabel that she really believed she had now got hold of something that would lead to something. On the receipt of Lady Pensel's letter (Mr. Bantling had virtually guaranteed the arrival of this document) she would immediately depart for Bedfordshire, and if Isabel cared to look out for her impressions in the Interviewer, she would certainly find them. Henrietta was evidently going to see something of the inner life this time. "Do you know where you're drifting, Henrietta Stackpole?" Isabel asked, imitating the tone in which her friend had spoken the night before. "I'm drifting to a big position, that of the Queen of American journalism. If my next letter isn't copied all over the West, I'll swallow my penwiper." She had arranged with her friend Miss Annie Climber, the young lady of the Continental office, that they should go together to make those purchases which were to constitute Miss Climber's farewell to a hemisphere in which she at least had been appreciated, and she presently repaired to Jermyn Street to pick up her companion. Shortly after her departure Ralph Touchett was announced, and as soon as he came in Isabel saw he had something on his mind. He very soon took his cousin into his confidence. He had received from his mother a telegram to the effect that his father had had a sharp attack of his old malady, that she was much alarmed, and that she begged he would instantly return to Gardencourt. On this occasion, at least, Mrs. Touchett's devotion to the electric wire was not open to criticism. "I've judged it best to see the great doctor, Sir Matthew Hope, first," Ralph said. "By great good luck he's in town. He's to see me at 12:30, and I shall make sure of his coming down to Gardencourt, which he will do the more readily as he has already seen my father several times, both there and in London. There's an express at 2:45 which I shall take, and you'll come back with me or remain here a few days longer, exactly as you prefer." "I shall certainly go with you," Isabel returned. "I don't suppose I can be of any use to my uncle, but if he's ill I should like to be near him." "I think you're fond of him," said Ralph, with a certain shy pleasure in his face. "You appreciate him, which all the world hasn't done. The quality's too fine." "I quite adore him," Isabel after a moment said. "That's very well. After his son he's your greatest admirer." She welcomed this assurance, but she gave secretly a small sigh of relief at the thought that Mr. Touchett was one of those admirers who couldn't propose to marry her. This, however, was not what she spoke. She went on to inform Ralph that there were other reasons for her not remaining in London. She was tired of it, and wished to leave it; and then Henrietta was going away, going to stay in Bedfordshire. In Bedfordshire? With Lady Pensel, the sister of Mr. Bantling, who has answered for an invitation. Ralph was feeling anxious, but at this he broke into a laugh. Suddenly, none the less, his gravity returned. "Bantling's a man of courage. But if the invitation should get lost on the way?" "I thought the British Post Office was impeccable." "The good Homer sometimes nods," said Ralph. "However," he went on more brightly, "the good Bantling never does, and whatever happens he'll take care of Henrietta." Ralph went to keep his appointment with Sir Matthew Hope, and Isabel made her arrangements for quitting Pratt's Hotel. Her uncle's danger touched her nearly, and while she stood before her open trunk, looking about her vaguely for what she should put into it, the tears suddenly rose to her eyes. It was perhaps for this reason that when Ralph came back at 2:00 to take her to the station, she was not yet ready. He found Miss Stackpole, however, in the sitting room, where she had just risen from her luncheon, and this lady immediately expressed her regret at his father's illness. "He's a grand old man," she said. "He's faithful to the last. If it's really to be the last, pardon my alluding to it, but you must often have thought of the possibility, I'm sorry that I shall not be at Gardencourt." "You'll amuse yourself much more in Bedfordshire." "I shall be sorry to amuse myself at such a time," said Henrietta with much propriety. But she immediately added, "I should like so to commemorate the closing scene." "My father may live a long time," said Ralph simply. Then, adverting to topics more cheerful, he interrogated Miss Stackpole as to her own future. Now that Ralph was in trouble she addressed him in a tone of larger allowance, and told him that she was much indebted to him for having made her acquaintance with Mr. Bantling. "He has told me just the things I want to know," she said, "all the society items and all about the royal family. I can't make out that what he tells me about the royal family is much to their credit, but he says that's only my peculiar way of looking at it. Well, all I want is that he should give me the facts. I can put them together quick enough once I've got them." And she added that Mr. Bantling had been so good as to promise to come and take her out that afternoon. "To take you where?" Ralph ventured to inquire. "To Buckingham Palace. He's going to show me over it, so that I may get some idea of how they live." "Ah," said Ralph, "we leave you in good hands. The first thing we shall hear is that you're invited to Windsor Castle." "If they ask me, I shall certainly go. Once I get started, I'm not afraid. But for all that," Henrietta added in a moment, "I'm not satisfied. I'm not at peace about Isabel." "What is her last misdemeanour?" "Well, I've told you before, and I suppose there's no harm in my going on. I always finish a subject that I take up. Mr. Goodwood was here last night." Ralph opened his eyes. He even blushed a little, his blush being the sign of an emotion somewhat acute. He remembered that Isabel, in separating from him in Winchester Square, had repudiated his suggestion that her motive in doing so was the expectation of a visitor at Pratt's Hotel, and it was a new pang to him to have to suspect her of duplicity. On the other hand, he quickly said to himself, what concern was it of his that she should have made an appointment with a lover? Had it not been thought graceful in every age that young ladies should make a mystery of such appointments? Ralph gave Miss Stackpole a diplomatic answer. "I should have thought that, with the views you expressed to me the other day, this would satisfy you perfectly." That he should come to see her? That was very well, as far as it went. It was a little plot of mine. I let him know that we were in London, and when it had been arranged that I should spend the evening out, I sent him a word, the word we just utter to the wise. I hoped he would find her alone. I won't pretend I didn't hope that you'd be out of the way. He came to see her, but he might as well have stayed away." "Isabel was cruel?" And Ralph's face lighted with the relief of his cousin's not having shown duplicity. "I don't know exactly what passed between them, but she gave him no satisfaction. She sent him back to America." "Poor Mr. Goodwood!" Ralph sighed. "Her only idea seems to be to get rid of him," Henrietta went on. "Poor Mr. Goodwood!" Ralph repeated. The exclamation, it must be confessed, was automatic. It failed exactly to express his thoughts, which were taking another line. "You don't say that as if you felt it. I don't believe you care." "Ah," said Ralph, "you must remember that I don't know this interesting young man, that I've never seen him." "Well, I shall see him, and I shall tell him not to give up. If I didn't believe Isabel would come round," Miss Stackpole added, "well, I'd give up myself. I mean I'd give her up." Chapter 18. Of the Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18 It had occurred to Ralph that, in the conditions, Isabel's parting with her friend might be of a slightly embarrassed nature, and he went down to the door of the hotel in advance of his cousin, who, after a slight delay, followed with the traces of an unaccepted remonstrance, as he thought, in her eyes. The two made the journey to Garden Court in almost unbroken silence, and the servant who met them at the station had no better news to give them of Mr. Touchett, a fact which caused Ralph to congratulate himself afresh on Sir Matthew Hope's having promised to come down in the 5 o'clock train and spend the night. Mrs. Touchett, he learned, on reaching home, had been constantly with the old man, and was with him at that moment, and this fact made Ralph say to himself that, after all, what his mother wanted was just easy occasion. The finer natures were those that shone at the larger times. Isabel went to her own room, noting throughout the house that perceptible hush which precedes a crisis. At the end of an hour, however, she came downstairs in search of her aunt, whom she wished to ask about Mr. Touchett. She went into the library, but Mrs. Touchett was not there, and as the weather, which had been damp and chill, was now altogether spoiled, it was not probable she had gone for her usual walk in the grounds. Isabel was on the point of ringing to send a question to her room, when this purpose quickly yielded to an unexpected sound, the sound of low music proceeding apparently from the saloon. She knew that her aunt never touched the piano, and the musician was therefore probably Ralph, who played for his own amusement. That he should have resorted to this recreation at the present time indicated apparently that his anxiety about his father had been relieved, so that the girl took her way, almost with restored cheer, towards the source of the harmony. The drawing-room at Gardencourt was an apartment of great distances, and, as the piano was placed at the end of it furthest removed from the door at which she entered, her arrival was not noticed by the person seated before the instrument. This person was neither Ralph nor his mother. It was the lady whom Isabel immediately saw to be a stranger to herself, though her back was presented to the door. This back, an ample and well-dressed one, Isabel viewed for some moments with surprise. The lady was of course a visitor, who had arrived during her absence, and who had not been mentioned by either of the servants, one of them her aunt's maid, of whom she had had speech since her return. Isabel had already learned, however, with what treasures of reserve the function of receiving orders may be accompanied, and she was particularly conscious of having been treated with dryness by her aunt's maid, through whose hands she had slipped perhaps a little too mistrustfully, and with an effective plumage but the more lustrous. The advent of a guest was in itself far from disconcerting. She had not yet divested herself of a young faith that each new acquaintance would exert some momentous influence on her life. By the time she had made these reflections, she became aware that the lady at the piano played remarkably well. She was playing something of Schubert's, Isabel knew not what, but recognised Schubert, and she touched the piano with a discretion of her own. It showed skill, it showed feeling. Isabel sat down noiselessly on the nearest chair, and waited till the end of the piece. When it was finished, she felt a strong desire to thank the player, and rose from her seat to do so, while at the same time the stranger turned quickly round, as if but just aware of her presence. "That's very beautiful, and your playing makes it more beautiful still," said Isabel, with all the young radiance with which she usually uttered a truthful rapture. "You don't think I disturbed Mr. Touchett, then?" the musician answered as sweetly as this compliment deserved. "The house is so large, and his room so far away, that I thought I might venture, especially as I played just du bout des doigts." "She's a Frenchwoman," Isabel said to herself. "She says that as if she were French." And this supposition made the visitor more interesting to our speculative heroine. "I hope my uncle's doing well," Isabel added. "I should think that to hear such lovely music as that would really make him feel better." The lady smiled and discriminated. "I'm afraid there are moments in life when even Schubert has nothing to say to us. We must admit, however, that they are our worst." "I'm not in that state now, then," said Isabel. "On the contrary, I should be so glad if you would play something more." "If it will give you pleasure, delighted." And this obliging person took her place again and struck a few chords, while Isabel sat down nearer the instrument. Suddenly the new comer stopped with her hands on the keys, half turning and looking over her shoulder. She was 40 years old, and not pretty, though her expression charmed. "Pardon me," she said, "but are you the niece, the young American?" "I'm my aunt's niece," Isabel replied with simplicity. The lady at the piano sat still a moment longer, casting her air of interest over her shoulder. "That's very well. We're compatriots." And then she began to play. "Ah, then she's not French," Isabel murmured, and as the opposite supposition had made her romantic, it might have seemed that this revelation would have marked a drop. But such was not the fact. Rarer even than to be French seemed it to be American on such interesting terms. The lady played in the same manner as before, softly and solemnly, and while she played the shadows deepened in the room. The autumn twilight gathered in, and from her place Isabel could see the rain, which had now begun in earnest, washing the cold-looking lawn and the wind shaking the great trees. At last, when the music had ceased, her companion got up, and coming nearer with a smile, before Isabel had time to thank her again, said, "I'm very glad you've come back. I've heard a great deal about you." Isabel thought her a very attractive person, but nevertheless spoke with a certain abruptness in reply to this speech. "From whom have you heard about me?" The stranger hesitated a single moment, and then, "From your uncle," she answered. "I've been here 3 days, and the first day he let me come and pay him a visit in his room. Then he talked constantly of you." "As you didn't know me, that must have rather bored you." "It made me want to know you. All the more that since then, your aunt being so much with Mr. Touchett, I've been quite alone and have got rather tired of my own society. I've not chosen a good moment for my visit." A servant had come in with lamps and was presently followed by another bearing the tea tray. On the appearance of this repast Mrs. Touchett had apparently been notified, for she now arrived and addressed herself to the teapot. Her greeting to her niece did not differ materially from her manner of raising the lid of this receptacle in order to glance at the contents. In neither act was it becoming to make a show of avidity. Questioned about her husband, she was unable to say he was better, but the local doctor was with him, and much light was expected from this gentleman's consultation with Sir Matthew Hope. "I suppose you two ladies have made acquaintance," she pursued. "If you haven't, I recommend you to do so, for so long as we continue, Ralph and I, to cluster about Mr. Touchett's bed, you're not likely to have much society but each other." "I know nothing about you but that you're a great musician," Isabel said to the visitor. "There's a good deal more than that to know," Mrs. Touchett affirmed in her little dry tone. "A very little of it, I'm sure, will content Miss Archer," the lady exclaimed with a light laugh. "I'm an old friend of your aunt's. I've lived much in Florence. I'm Madame Merle." She made this last announcement as if she were referring to a person of tolerably distinct identity. For Isabel, however, it represented little. She could only continue to feel that Madame Merle had as charming a manner as any she had ever encountered. "She's not a foreigner, in spite of her name," said Mrs. Touchett. "She was born—I always forget where you were born." "It's hardly worth while, then, I should tell you." "On the contrary," said Mrs. Touchett, who rarely missed a logical point, "if I remembered, your telling me would be quite superfluous." Madame Merle glanced at Isabel with a sort of world-wide smile, a thing that overreached frontiers. "I was born under the shadow of the national banner." "She's too fond of mystery," said Mrs. Touchett. "That's her great fault." "Ah!" exclaimed Madame Merle, "I've great faults, but I don't think that's one of them. It certainly isn't the greatest. I came into the world in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. My father was a high officer in the United States Navy and had a post of responsibility in that establishment at the time. I suppose I ought to love the sea, but I hate it. That's why I don't return to America. I love the land. The great thing is to love something." Isabel, as a dispassionate witness, had not been struck with the force of Mrs. Touchett's characterisation of her visitor, who had an expressive, communicative, responsive face, by no means of the sort which, to Isabel's mind, suggested a secretive disposition. It was a face that told of an amplitude of nature and of quick and free motions, and though it had no regular beauty, was in the highest degree engaging and attaching. Madame Merle was a tall, fair, smooth woman. Everything in her person was round and replete, though without those accumulations which suggest heaviness. Her features were thick, but in perfect proportion and harmony, and her complexion had a healthy clearness. Her grey eyes were small, but full of light, and incapable of stupidity; incapable, according to some people, even of tears. She had a liberal, full-rimmed mouth, which, when she smiled, drew itself upward to the left side in a manner that most people thought very odd, some very affected, and a few very graceful. Isabel inclined to range herself in the last category. Madame Merle had thick fair hair, arranged somehow classically, and as if she were a bust, Isabel judged, a Juno or a Niobe, and large white hands of a perfect shape, a shape so perfect that their possessor, preferring to leave them unadorned, wore no jewelled rings. Isabel had taken her at first, as we have seen, for a Frenchwoman, but extended observation might have ranked her as a German of high degree, perhaps an Austrian, a baroness, a countess, a princess. It would never have been supposed that she had come into the world in Brooklyn, though one could doubtless not have carried through any argument that the air of distinction marking her in so eminent a degree was inconsistent with such a birth. It was true that the national banner had floated immediately over her cradle, and the breezy freedom of the stars and stripes might have shed an influence upon the attitude she there took towards life. And yet she had evidently nothing of the fluttered, flapping quality of a morsel of bunting in the wind. Her manner expressed the repose and confidence which come from a large experience. Experience, however, had not quenched her youth; it had simply made her sympathetic and supple. She was, in a word, a woman of strong impulses kept in admirable order. This commended itself to Isabel as an ideal combination. The girl made these reflections while the three ladies sat at their tea, but that ceremony was interrupted before long by the arrival of the great doctor from London, who had been immediately ushered into the drawing-room. Mrs. Touchett took him off to the library for a private talk, and then Madame Merle and Isabel parted to meet again at dinner. The idea of seeing more of this interesting woman did much to mitigate Isabel's sense of the sadness now settling on Gardencourt. When she came into the drawing-room before dinner she found the place empty, but in the course of a moment Ralph arrived. His anxiety about his father had been lightened. Sir Matthew Hope's view of his condition was less depressed than his own had been. The doctor recommended that the nurse alone should remain with the old man for the next 3 or 4 hours, so that Ralph, his mother, and the great physician himself were free to dine at table. Mrs. Touchett and Sir Matthew appeared. Madame Merle was the last. Before she came Isabel spoke of her to Ralph, who was standing before the fireplace. "Pray, who is this Madame Merle?" "The cleverest woman I know, not excepting yourself," said Ralph. "I thought she seemed very pleasant." "I was sure you'd think her very pleasant." "Is that why you invited her?" "I didn't invite her, and when we came back from London I didn't know she was here. No one invited her. She's a friend of my mother's, and just after you and I went to town my mother got a note from her. She had arrived in England (she usually lives abroad, though she has first and last spent a good deal of time here), and asked leave to come down for a few days. She's a woman who can make such proposals with perfect confidence. She's so welcome wherever she goes. And with my mother there could be no question of hesitating. She's the one person in the world whom my mother very much admires. If she were not herself, which she after all much prefers, she would like to be Madame Merle. It would indeed be a great change." "Well, she's very charming," said Isabel, "and she plays beautifully." "She does everything beautifully. She's complete." Isabel looked at her cousin a moment. "You don't like her?" "On the contrary, I was once in love with her." "And she didn't care for you, and that's why you don't like her?" "How can we have discussed such things? Monsieur Merle was then living." "Is he dead now?" "So she says." "Don't you believe her?" "Yes, because the statement agrees with the probabilities. The husband of Madame Merle would be likely to pass away." Isabel gazed at her cousin again. "I don't know what you mean. You mean something that you don't mean. What was Monsieur Merle?" "The husband of Madame." "You're very odious. Has she any children?" "Not the least little child, fortunately." "Fortunately?" "I mean, fortunately for the child. She'd be sure to spoil it." Isabel was apparently on the point of assuring her cousin for the third time that he was odious. But the discussion was interrupted by the arrival of the lady who was the topic of it. She came rustling in quickly, apologizing for being late, fastening a bracelet, dressed in dark blue satin, which exposed a white bosom that was ineffectually covered by a curious silver necklace. Ralph offered her his arm with the exaggerated alertness of a man who was no longer a lover. Even if this had still been his condition, however, Ralph had other things to think about. The great doctor spent the night at Gardencourt, and, returning to London on the morrow, after another consultation with Mr. Touchett's own medical adviser, concurred in Ralph's desire that he should see the patient again on the day following. On the day following Sir Matthew Hope reappeared at Gardencourt, and now took a less encouraging view of the old man, who had grown worse in the 24 hours. His feebleness was extreme, and to his son, who constantly sat by his bedside, it often seemed that his end must be at hand. The local doctor, a very sagacious man, in whom Ralph had secretly more confidence than in his distinguished colleague, was constantly in attendance, and Sir Matthew Hope came back several times. Mr. Touchett was much of the time unconscious. He slept a great deal. He rarely spoke. Isabel had a great desire to be useful to him, and was allowed to watch with him at hours when his other attendants, of whom Mrs. Touchett was not the least regular, went to take rest. He never seemed to know her, and she always said to herself, "Suppose he should die while I'm sitting here," an idea which excited her and kept her awake. Once he opened his eyes for a while and fixed them upon her intelligently, but when she went to him, hoping he would recognise her, he closed them and relapsed into stupor. The day after this, however, he revived for a longer time, but on this occasion Ralph only was with him. The old man began to talk, much to his son's satisfaction, who assured him that they should presently have him sitting up. "No, my boy," said Mr. Touchett, "not unless you bury me in a sitting posture, as some of the ancients—was it the ancients?—used to do." "Ah, Daddy, don't talk about that," Ralph murmured. "You mustn't deny that you're getting better." "There will be no need of my denying it if you don't say it," the old man answered. "Why should we prevaricate just at the last? We never prevaricated before. I've got to die some time, and it's better to die when one's sick than when one's well. I'm very sick as I shall ever be. I hope you don't want to prove that I shall ever be worse than this? That would be too bad. You don't? Well, then." Having made this excellent point, he became quiet, but the next time that Ralph was with him he again addressed himself to conversation. The nurse had gone to her supper, and Ralph was alone in charge, having just relieved Mrs. Touchett, who had been on guard since dinner. The room was lighted only by the flickering fire, which of late had become necessary, and Ralph's tall shadow was projected over wall and ceiling with an outline constantly varying but always grotesque. "Who's that with me? Is it my son?" the old man asked. "Yes, it's your son, Daddy." "And is there no one else?" "No one else." Mr. Touchett said nothing for a while, and then, "I want to talk a little," he went on. "Won't it tire you?" Ralph demurred. "It won't matter if it does. I shall have a long rest. I want to talk about you." Ralph had drawn nearer to the bed. He sat leaning forward with his hand on his father's. "You had better select a brighter topic." "You always were bright. I used to be proud of your brightness. I should like so much to think you'd do something." "If you leave us," said Ralph, "I shall do nothing but miss you." "That's just what I don't want. It's what I want to talk about. You must get a new interest." "I don't want a new interest, Daddy. I have more old ones than I know what to do with." The old man lay there looking at his son. His face was the face of the dying, but his eyes were the eyes of Daniel Touchett. He seemed to be reckoning over Ralph's interests. "Of course you have your mother," he said at last. "You'll take care of her." "My mother will always take care of herself," Ralph returned. "Well," said his father, "perhaps as she grows older she'll need a little help." "I shall not see that. She'll outlive me." "Very likely she will. But that's no reason—" Mr. Touchett let his phrase die away in a helpless but not quite querulous sigh, and remained silent again. "Don't trouble yourself about us," said his son. "My mother and I get on very well together, you know." "You get on by always being apart. That's not natural." "If you leave us we shall probably see more of each other." "Well," the old man observed with wandering irrelevance, "it can't be said that my death will make much difference in your mother's life." "It will probably make more than you think." "Well, she'll have more money," said Mr. Touchett. "I've left her a good wife's portion, just as if she had been a good wife." "She has been one, Daddy, according to her own theory. She has never troubled you." "Ah, some troubles are pleasant," Mr. Touchett murmured. "Those you've given me, for instance. But your mother has been less—what shall I call it?—less out of the way since I've been ill. I presume she knows I've noticed it." "I shall certainly tell her so. I'm so glad you mention it." "It won't make any difference to her. She doesn't do it to please me. She does it to please—" and he lay a while trying to think why she did it. "She does it because it suits her. But that's not what I want to talk about," he added. "It's about you. You'll be very well off." "Yes," said Ralph, "I know that. But I hope you've not forgotten the talk we had a year ago, when I told you exactly what money I should need, and begged you to make some good use of the rest?" "Yes, yes, I remember. I made a new will in a few days. I suppose it was the first time such a thing had happened, a young man trying to get a will made against him." "It is not against me," said Ralph. "It would be against me to have a large property to take care of. It's impossible for a man in my state of health to spend much money, and enough is as good as a feast." "Well, you'll have enough, and something over. There will be more than enough for one. There will be enough for two." "That's too much," said Ralph. "Ah, don't say that. The best thing you can do when I'm gone will be to marry." Ralph had foreseen what his father was coming to, and this suggestion was by no means fresh. It had long been Mr. Touchett's most ingenious way of taking the cheerful view of his son's possible duration. Ralph had usually treated it facetiously, but present circumstances prescribed the facetious. He simply fell back in his chair and returned his father's appealing gaze. "If I, with a wife who hasn't been very fond of me, have had a very happy life," said the old man, carrying his ingenuity further still, "what a life mightn't you have if you should marry a person different from Mrs. Touchett? There are more different from her than there are like her." Ralph still said nothing, and after a pause his father resumed softly: "What do you think of your cousin?" At this Ralph started, meeting the question with a strained smile. "Do I understand you to propose that I should marry Isabel?" "Well, that's what it comes to in the end. Don't you like Isabel?" "Yes, very much." And Ralph got up from his chair and wandered over to the fire. He stood before it an instant and then he stooped and stirred it mechanically. "I like Isabel very much," he repeated. "Well," said his father, "I know she likes you. She has told me how much she likes you." "Did she remark that she would like to marry me?" "No, but she can't have anything against you. And she's the most charming young lady I've ever seen. And she would be good to you. I have thought a great deal about it." "So have I," said Ralph, coming back to the bedside again. "I don't mind telling you that." "You are in love with her then? I should think you would be. It's as if she came over on purpose." "No, I'm not in love with her. But I should be if certain things were different." "Ah, things are always different from what they might be," said the old man. "If you wait for them to change you'll never do anything. I don't know whether you know," he went on, "but I suppose there's no harm in my alluding to it at such an hour as this. There was some one wanted to marry Isabel the other day and she wouldn't have him." "I know she refused Warburton. He told me himself." "Well, that proves there's a chance for somebody else." "Somebody else took his chance the other day in London and got nothing by it." "Was it you?" Mr. Tutchett eagerly asked. "No, it was an older friend, a poor gentleman who came over from America to see about it." "Well, I'm sorry for him, whoever he was. But it only proves what I say, that the way's open to you." "If it is, dear father, it's all the greater pity that I'm unable to tread it. I haven't many convictions, but I have 3 or 4 that I hold strongly. One is that people, on the whole, had better not marry their cousins. Another is that people in an advanced stage of pulmonary disorder had better not marry at all." The old man raised his weak hand and moved it to and fro before his face. "What do you mean by that? You look at things in a way that would make everything wrong. What sort of a cousin is a cousin that you had never seen for more than 20 years of her life? We're all each other's cousins, and if we stopped at that the human race would die out. It's just the same with your bad lung. You're a great deal better than you used to be. All you want is to lead a natural life. It is a great deal more natural to marry a pretty young lady that you're in love with than it is to remain single on false principles." "I'm not in love with Isabel," said Ralph. "You said just now that you would be if you didn't think it wrong. I want to prove to you that it isn't wrong." "It will only tire you, dear daddy," said Ralph, who marvelled at his father's tenacity and at his finding strength to insist. "Then where shall we all be?" "Where shall you be if I don't provide for you? You won't have anything to do with the bank, and you won't have me to take care of. You say you've so many interests, but I can't make them out." Ralph leaned back in his chair with folded arms. His eyes were fixed for some time in meditation. At last, with the air of a man fairly mustering courage: "I take a great interest in my cousin," he said, "but not the sort of interest you desire. I shall not live many years, but I hope I shall live long enough to see what she does with herself. She's entirely independent of me. I can exercise very little influence upon her life. But I should like to do something for her." "What should you like to do?" "I should like to put a little wind in her sails." "What do you mean by that?" "I should like to put it into her power to do some of the things she wants. She wants to see the world, for instance. I should like to put money in her purse." "Ah, I'm glad you've thought of that," said the old man. "But I've thought of it too. I've left her a legacy, £5,000." "That's capital. It's very kind of you. But I should like to do a little more." Something of that veiled acuteness with which it had been on Daniel Touchett's part the habit of a lifetime to listen to a financial proposition still lingered in the face in which the invalid had not obliterated the man of business. "I shall be happy to consider it," he said softly. "Isabel's poor, then. My mother tells me that she has but a few $100s a year. I should like to make her rich." "What do you mean by rich?" "I call people rich when they're able to meet the requirements of their imagination. Isabel has a great deal of imagination." "So have you, my son," said Mr. Touchett, listening very attentively, but a little confusedly. "You tell me I shall have money enough for two. What I want is that you should kindly relieve me of my superfluity and make it over to Isabel. Divide my inheritance into 2 equal halves and give her the second." "To do what she likes with?" "Absolutely what she likes." "And without an equivalent?" "What equivalent could there be?" "The one I've already mentioned." "Her marrying some one or other? It's just to do away with anything of that sort that I make my suggestion. If she has an easy income she'll never have to marry for a support. That's what I want cannily to prevent. She wishes to be free, and your bequest will make her free." "Well, you seem to have thought it out," said Mr. Touchett. "But I don't see why you appeal to me. The money will be yours, and you can easily give it to her yourself." Ralph openly stared. "Ah, dear father, I can't offer Isabel money." The old man gave a groan. "Don't tell me you're not in love with her. Do you want me to have the credit of it?" "Entirely. I should like it simply to be a clause in your will, without the slightest reference to me." "Do you want me to make a new will, then?" "A few words will do it. You can attend to it the next time you feel a little lively." "You must telegraph to Mr. Hilary, then. I'll do nothing without my solicitor." "You shall see Mr. Hilary to morrow." "He'll think we've quarrelled, you and I," said the old man. "Very probably. I should like him to think it," said Ralph, smiling. "And, to carry out the idea, I give you notice that I shall be very sharp, quite horrid and strange with you." The humour of this appeared to touch his father, who lay a little while taking it in. "I'll do anything you like," Mr. Touchett said at last, "but I'm not sure it's right. You say you want to put wind in her sails, but aren't you afraid of putting too much?" "I should like to see her going before the breeze," Ralph answered. "You speak as if it were for your mere amusement." "So it is, a good deal." "Well, I don't think I understand," said Mr. Touchett with a sigh. "Young men are very different from what I was. When I cared for a girl, when I was young, I wanted to do more than look at her. You've scruples that I shouldn't have had, and you've ideas that I shouldn't have had either. You say Isabel wants to be free, and that her being rich will keep her from marrying for money. Do you think that she's a girl to do that?" "By no means. But she has less money than she has ever had before. Her father then gave her everything because he used to spend his capital. She has nothing but the crumbs of that feast to live on, and she doesn't really know how meagre they are. She has yet to learn it. My mother has told me all about it. Isabel will learn it when she's really thrown upon the world, and it would be very painful to me to think of her coming to the consciousness of a lot of wants she should be unable to satisfy." "I've left her £5,000. She can satisfy a good many wants with that." "She can indeed, but she would probably spend it in 2 or 3 years." "You think she'd be extravagant then?" "Most certainly," said Ralph, smiling serenely. Poor Mr. Touchett's acuteness was rapidly giving place to pure confusion. "It would merely be a question of time then, her spending the larger sum?" "No, though at first I think she'd plunge into that pretty freely. She'd probably make over a part of it to each of her sisters. But after that she'd come to her senses, remember she still has a lifetime before her, and live within her means." "Well, you have worked it out," said the old man helplessly. "You do take an interest in her, certainly." "You can't consistently say I go too far. You wished me to go further." "Well, I don't know," Mr. Tutchett answered. "I don't think I enter into your spirit. It seems to me immoral." "Immoral, dear daddy?" "Well, I don't know that it's right to make everything so easy for a person." "It surely depends upon the person. When the person's good, your making things easy is all to the credit of virtue. To facilitate the execution of good impulses, what can be a nobler act?" This was a little difficult to follow, and Mr. Tutchett considered it for a while. At last he said: "Isabel's a sweet young thing, but do you think she's so good as that?" "She's as good as her best opportunities," Ralph returned. "Well," Mr. Tutchett declared, "she ought to get a great many opportunities for £60,000." "I've no doubt she will." "Of course I'll do what you want," said the old man. "I only want to understand it a little." "Well, dear daddy, don't you understand it now?" his son caressingly asked. "If you don't we won't take any more trouble about it. We'll leave it alone." Mr. Tutchett lay a long time still. Ralph supposed he had given up the attempt to follow. But at last, quite lucidly, he began again. "Tell me this first. Doesn't it occur to you that a young lady with £60,000 may fall a victim to the fortune hunters?" "She'll hardly fall a victim to more than one." "Well, one's too many." "Decidedly. That's a risk, and it has entered into my calculation. I think it's appreciable, but I think it's small, and I'm prepared to take it." Poor Mr. Tutchett's acuteness had passed into perplexity, and his perplexity now passed into admiration. "Well, you have gone into it," he repeated. "But I don't see what good you're to get of it." Ralph leaned over his father's pillows and gently smoothed them. He was aware their talk had been unduly prolonged. "I shall get just the good I said a few moments ago I wished to put into Isabel's reach. That of having met the requirements of my imagination. But it's scandalous the way I've taken advantage of you." Chapter 19